Right now, as you're watching this video, there's a good chance you're feeling it. That subtle tightness in your chest, that mental loop replaying the same worries over and over, that feeling that something is wrong, even though nothing specific is happening at this exact moment. We call it anxiety, and if you're living in the modern world, you've probably been told it's just part of life, something to manage with medication, therapy, or positive thinking. But what if I told you that 2,500 years ago, a man sitting under a tree in India figured out exactly what anxiety is at its deepest level, and more importantly, discovered a way to end it completely. Not manage it, not cope with it, but actually end it. That man was the Buddha, and what he understood about the human mind is so profound that modern psychology is only now beginning to catch up. In this video, we're going to explore what Buddhism reveals about the true nature of anxiety. And I'm warning you right now, this isn't going to be some superficial advice about breathing exercises or positive affirmations. This goes deep, to the very root of why your mind creates suffering in the first place. Let's start with something most people don't realize. Buddhism doesn't actually have a word that translates perfectly to our modern concept of anxiety. Instead, the Buddha talked about something called dukkha, which is often translated as suffering, but that translation doesn't capture the full meaning. Dukkha is more like a pervasive sense of dissatisfaction, unease, stress, and yes, anxiety that permeates human existence. It's that background hum of discomfort that you might not even notice until you really pay attention. The Buddha's first noble truth is that dukkha exists. Life involves suffering. But here's where it gets interesting and where Buddhism diverges completely from how we think about anxiety in the West. The Buddha didn't say that suffering comes from external circumstances. He didn't say you're anxious because your job is stressful, or because your relationships are complicated, or because the world is falling apart. He said something far more radical. He said that the root cause of all suffering, including what we experience as anxiety, comes from within your own mind, specifically from three things he called the three poisons: craving, aversion, and delusion. When the Buddha talked about craving, he wasn't just talking about wanting a new car or craving chocolate. He was talking about a fundamental way that your mind operates, a constant reaching for something other than what is present right now. Think about anxiety for a moment. Really think about it. What is anxiety if not your mind reaching into the future, trying to control outcomes that haven't happened yet, worrying about scenarios that exist only in your imagination? Every time you think, what if this happens, or what if that goes wrong, your mind is engaging in craving. It's craving certainty in an uncertain world. It's craving security in an insecure existence. It's craving permanence in an impermanent reality. And here's the kicker. The more you crave certainty, the more anxiety you create, because the universe is fundamentally uncertain. You cannot control the future, no matter how much you plan, worry, or try to anticipate every possible outcome. So your mind is essentially fighting a battle it can never win, and that battle is what we experience as anxiety. The second poison is aversion, and this is where things get really interesting. Aversion is the flip side of craving. It's the mind's tendency to push away, reject, and resist what's actually happening in the present moment. Think about how you relate to your anxiety. When that tight feeling shows up in your chest, when those worried thoughts start spiraling, what's your first instinct? To get rid of it, right? To make it stop. To distract yourself, to take a pill, to scroll through your phone, anything to avoid feeling what you're feeling. But here's what Buddhism discovered that Western psychology is only recently beginning to understand. The resistance to anxiety is actually what keeps it alive. When you fight against your anxious thoughts and feelings, when you tell yourself, I shouldn't feel this way, or there's something wrong with me for feeling anxious, you're actually adding a second layer of suffering on top of the initial discomfort. The Buddha called this the second arrow. The first arrow is the actual experience of anxiety, the physical sensations, the worried thoughts. The second arrow is your reaction to it, your judgment of it, your resistance to it. And here's the profound insight. While you might not always have control over the first arrow, you absolutely have control over whether you shoot the second one. The third poison is delusion, and this is the deepest one, the one that underlies the other two. In Buddhism, Delusion refers to a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of reality, specifically the delusion of a separate, permanent, independent self. When you look closely at your direct experience, not at your thoughts about your experience, but at the actual raw experience itself, can you find a solid, unchanging self that is having anxiety? Or do you find instead a constantly changing stream of thoughts, sensations, emotions, and perceptions? Buddhism says that what we call the self is actually a process, not a thing. It's like a river that we give a name to, but the water is constantly changing. There's no permanent fixed river, just water flowing. Similarly, there's no permanent fixed self, just experiences arising and passing away moment by moment. And here's why this matters for anxiety. So much of anxiety comes from defending and protecting this sense of self. You worry about what people think of you because you believe there's a you that can be threatened. You're afraid of failure because you believe there's a you that can be diminished. You're anxious about the future because you believe there's a you that might not be okay. But what if that whole framework is based on a misunderstanding? Now let's talk about what the Buddha actually taught about ending this suffering. Because unlike a lot of modern approaches to anxiety that focus on management or coping, Buddhism is actually about liberation. Buddhism doesn't try to eliminate anxiety by changing your external circumstances, or by replacing negative thoughts with positive ones, or by avoiding situations that make you anxious. Instead, it works by fundamentally changing your relationship to your experience. It teaches you to see clearly what's actually happening in your mind and body, and through that clear seeing, the patterns that create suffering naturally begin to dissolve. The foundation of this whole approach is something called mindfulness, but not the watered-down, commercialized version you see in apps and corporate wellness programs. Traditional Buddhist mindfulness is about developing a very specific quality of attention. It's the ability to be present with your experience exactly as it is, without trying to change it, without judging it, without getting lost in stories about it, just seeing clearly. And this is absolutely revolutionary when it comes to anxiety, because anxiety exists almost entirely in the space between you and the present moment. Anxiety is your mind time-traveling to a future that doesn't exist, or rehashing a past that's already gone. When you're fully present, actually here now in this moment, anxiety has nowhere to exist. That doesn't mean uncomfortable sensations or thoughts disappear, but the suffering around them, the anxiety about the anxiety, the fear of the fear, that begins to dissolve. Here's a practical example. Let's say you're anxious about a presentation you have to give next week. In a normal state of mind, this anxiety spirals. You think about the presentation, which triggers worried thoughts about forgetting what to say, which triggers images of people judging you, which triggers physical sensations of tension and discomfort, which trigger more worried thoughts, and around you go. You're living next week's presentation right now, suffering through it multiple times before it even happens. But with mindfulness, something different becomes possible. You notice there's a thought about the presentation. You notice there's a tightness in the chest. You notice there's an image of forgetting my words. And you simply observe these things arising and passing in awareness without getting on the train with them. You're not suppressing them or fighting them. You're just seeing them clearly for what they are. Temporary mental and physical events that come and go. And when you relate to your anxious thoughts and sensations in this way, when you stop feeding them with resistance and reaction, they naturally begin to quiet down. But mindfulness is just the beginning. The Buddha also taught something called insight meditation or vipassana, which takes mindfulness deeper. While mindfulness is about being present with your experience, insight meditation is about investigating the nature of that experience and seeing directly the three characteristics that the Buddha said mark all of existence: impermanence, suffering, and non-self. Let's look at how understanding each of these transforms your relationship with anxiety. First, impermanence. Everything that arises passes away. Every sensation, every emotion, every thought, every state of mind. When you're caught in anxiety, it feels permanent. It feels like it will last forever, like you'll always feel this way. But when you actually pay close attention to your direct experience, you see that even the most intense anxiety is made up of individual sensations and thoughts that arise and pass away moment by moment. That tightness in your chest isn't a solid block of sensation. It's actually a constantly changing pattern of pulses and tensions that come and go. Those worried thoughts aren't a continuous stream. They're individual thoughts that arise, peak and fade, with gaps in between. When you see this impermanence directly, not as an intellectual concept, but as a lived experience, something profound happens. The anxiety loses its solid, threatening quality. The second characteristic is suffering or unsatisfactoriness. When you see clearly that grasping at any experience, trying to make it permanent, trying to find lasting satisfaction in things that are by nature impermanent and unreliable, when you see that this is always a losing game, you begin to let go. Not through forcing or willpower, but through wisdom. You see, oh, this is what I'm doing. I'm trying to find security in a fundamentally insecure world. I'm trying to control what cannot be controlled. And in that seeing, the desperate quality of grasping begins to relax. You still engage with life, you still make plans and take action, but you're not holding on so tightly. You're not staking your entire well-being on outcomes you can't control. The third characteristic, non-self, is the deepest and most transformative. Most anxiety is driven by a sense that there's a vulnerable self that needs protection. You're anxious because you believe something bad might happen to you, to this entity you call me that you experience as being inside your head, looking out at the world. But when you investigate this self in meditation, when you really look for it in your direct experience, something astonishing happens. You can't find it. You find thoughts about self, sensations in the body, emotions, perceptions, memories, but you can't find an actual, solid, permanent self that's having these experiences. And this realization, when it goes deep, is utterly liberating, because so much of anxiety is about protecting a self that isn't there in the way you thought it was. Now let me address something important, because I know some of you are thinking this all sounds great, but I have real problems. I have bills to pay, relationships to navigate, health issues to deal with. Are you saying that's all just in my mind? No, absolutely not. Buddhism doesn't deny that challenging situations exist in the world. What it's saying is that your suffering around those situations, the anxiety that you add on top of whatever practical challenges you're facing, that's optional. That's created by your mind's way of relating to what's happening. Two people can lose their jobs on the same day. One person experiences this as a catastrophic threat to their entire existence. They spiral into anxiety, imagining homelessness, abandonment, total failure. The other person, while certainly not happy about losing their job, experiences it as a challenge to be dealt with. They feel disappointed, concerned, motivated to take action, but they don't fall into the pit of existential anxiety. What's the difference? The external situation is identical. The difference is in how their minds are relating to the situation. Let's get really practical, because I know some of you are thinking, okay, this is interesting philosophy. But what do I actually do when I'm lying awake at 3 in the morning with my mind racing? The most fundamental practice is bringing your attention to your breath. Not to change it, not to breathe deeply or slowly necessarily, but simply to feel it. To feel the sensation of air moving in and out of your nostrils, to feel your chest and belly expanding and contracting. Why the breath? Because the breath is always happening in the present moment. You can't breathe in the past or the future. So when you bring your attention to your breath, you're anchoring yourself in the one place where anxiety can't exist, right here, right now. When your mind wanders into anxious thoughts, and it will, you simply notice where it went and gently bring it back to the breath. Not with force, not with judgment, but with a kind of patient, gentle persistence. Another powerful practice is body scanning. You systematically bring your attention to different parts of your body, noticing whatever sensations are present without trying to change them. This is incredibly powerful for anxiety, because anxiety always has a physical component. Usually we try to ignore these sensations, or we get lost in stories about what they mean. But in body scanning, you simply feel them. You bring a quality of curiosity and openness to the physical experience of anxiety. And something amazing happens when you do this. The sensations start to reveal themselves as just sensations, not as signs that something terrible is happening. That tightness in your chest is just tightness. That churning in your stomach is just churning. They're unpleasant, yes, but they're not dangerous. Buddhism also teaches a practice called loving-kindness meditation, which might seem unrelated to anxiety, but is actually incredibly powerful. In this practice, you deliberately cultivate feelings of warmth, care, and friendliness toward yourself and others. You start with yourself, silently repeating phrases like, "May I be safe, may I be happy, may I be healthy, may I live with ease." This practice works on anxiety in several ways. First, it directly counters the harsh, critical voice that often accompanies anxiety. The voice that says, "You're not good enough, you're doing it wrong. There's something fundamentally wrong with you." By deliberately cultivating kindness toward yourself, you're training your mind in a different way of relating to your experience. Second, loving kindness practice helps you see that you're not alone in your suffering. Everyone experiences anxiety. This is part of being human. There's also a more advanced practice called noting, where you mentally label whatever is arising in your experience. Thinking, thinking, worrying, worrying, tension, tension, planning, planning. This simple act of noting creates a little bit of space between you and your experience. Instead of being completely identified with your anxious thoughts, you're observing them. You're the awareness that notices there's anxious thinking happening, rather than being completely lost in the content of those thoughts. This shift from being anxious to observing anxiety is subtle but profound. But here's something crucial that often gets missed. These practices aren't quick fixes. They're not techniques you use to make yourself feel better in the moment, although they often do have that effect. They're training programs for your mind. You're literally rewiring your brain, changing the default patterns of thinking and reacting that create suffering. This takes time, it takes practice. The Buddha compared it to training a wild animal. You don't expect to tame a wild elephant in a day. You patiently, consistently work with it, and gradually it becomes more manageable. Your mind is the same way, but if you practice consistently, something remarkable begins to happen. You start to see patterns you never noticed before. You catch yourself in the act of creating anxiety. You notice, oh, there's that worried thought again, or there's my mind trying to control the future again. And in that moment of noticing, you have a choice. You can follow the old pattern, or you can do something different. There's also a deeper understanding in Buddhism about the nature of thoughts that's absolutely crucial for dealing with anxiety. In the West, we tend to believe that our thoughts are true, that they reflect reality, that if we think something, we need to take it seriously. Buddhism has a completely different understanding. Thoughts are just mental events, not facts. They arise due to various causes and conditions, mostly outside your control, and they pass away. The thought something terrible is going to happen is not a prediction of the future. It's just a thought, a pattern of mental energy moving through consciousness. When you really get this, when you see it directly through meditation practice, it's incredibly liberating. You stop being at the mercy of every thought that passes through your mind. Now let's talk about something that might seem contradictory. Buddhism emphasizes acceptance, being with what is, not fighting against your experience, but it also emphasizes effort, practice, and following a path of training. How do these fit together? The acceptance that Buddhism teaches isn't passive resignation. It's about accepting what's actually happening right now, without adding resistance, and suffering on top of it, while also taking wise action to create the conditions for less suffering in the future. You're feeling anxious about your financial situation. Buddhist acceptance means you acknowledge the anxiety that's present. You feel the sensations in your body. You observe the worried thoughts. You don't fight against them. That's the acceptance part. But you also take practical action. You look at your budget, you explore options, you make a plan and follow through. That's the wise action part. What you don't do is spin in unproductive worry or avoid dealing with the situation because it makes you too anxious. This brings us to one of the most profound teachings in all of Buddhism, the middle way. The Buddha's enlightenment came after he abandoned both extreme self-indulgence and extreme ascetic practices. He realized that freedom comes not from either extreme, but from a balanced, moderate approach. One extreme is to be completely controlled by anxiety, to let it run your life, to avoid everything that makes you uncomfortable. The other extreme is to deny that you're anxious, to push it down, to force yourself through situations that are genuinely overwhelming. The middle way is to acknowledge your anxiety without being controlled by it, to work skillfully with it without being at war with it, to respect your limits without being limited by fear. As we come toward the end of this exploration, I want to emphasize something that might be the most important point of all. Buddhism's approach to ending anxiety isn't about eliminating all discomfort from your life. It's not about creating a perfect existence where nothing ever bothers you. It's about fundamentally changing your relationship to discomfort so that it no longer creates the kind of suffering we call anxiety. Life will always include challenges. People you love will get sick and die. You'll face failures and disappointments. You'll experience physical pain and difficult emotions. This is unavoidable. But the anxiety about these things, the mental suffering we create through craving, aversion, and delusion, that's optional. That's what the Buddhist path offers to end. And when that anxiety drops away, what remains is a kind of peace that can exist even in the midst of difficulty. The Buddha's final words, according to tradition, were all conditioned things are impermanent, strive with diligence. In other words, everything changes, so make the effort to wake up, to see clearly, to free yourself from unnecessary suffering. This is the invitation that Buddhism extends to all of us who struggle with anxiety, not a promise of a quick fix or an easy solution, but an invitation to a path of training that can lead to genuine freedom. A freedom that doesn't depend on your circumstances being just right, that doesn't depend on controlling outcomes or avoiding discomfort, but that comes from seeing clearly how your mind creates suffering and learning, gradually, to not do that anymore. This is what Buddhism reveals about anxiety, that it's not something that happens to you from outside, but something your mind creates through very specific mechanisms, and that once you see those mechanisms clearly and learn to work with them skillfully, you can be free in a way you might never have imagined was possible.